Okay, right. Just going to focus on how to structure the best possible answer during this session. We did content last week and that's already been uploaded to YouTube. So if you're unsure, go on the latest post. I think it says exam content and everything you need regarding the upcoming mock will be on there. So let's just have a quick look at the first question. Here you go. Now, this isn't going to be your question, obviously, but how do I zoom in? There you go. There you go. So you're going to get a source. It's going to say source A does something. It could be source A supports the return of a SAR. It could be that source A is critical of something. And then how do you know? So you're not expected to write big, long essays for this. It's a 4-mark question, but you've got to explain the source using your own knowledge. You've got to show a detailed understanding of what the source is showing. So regarding the SAR, this is what you did for your mock, and not really many people did very well on it because you didn't really know what the SAR was. Lots of people had forgotten. And that's understandable because it's not necessarily one of the major topics that we focus on. We do mention it, but we gloss over it pretty quickly. But source A supports the return of SAR to Germany. How do you know? Well, we know that source A supports the return of the SAR to Germany because what does it show? What the SAR's represented by what? Not what's the SAR represented by in this picture? The male, absolutely, the sun, and it says there, the male figure represents the SAR and the female figure represents Germany. So how do we know that this source supports the return of the SAR? Well, is she shooing him away with a gun or a knife? No, she's welcoming back, absolutely. She's hugging him like a long lost son. And the female there represents Germany, like a mother welcoming her son back. At the floor of his feet, what does this suggest that he's done what with these chains? Broken free of them, absolutely. He's been chained up by the Treaty of Versailles for 15 years. Now those 15 years are up. Germany wants the SAR back. And using the background, what does that industry, what does that represent? Why is that there? So why? Tell me about it. Explain it. Yeah. So why is it included in this picture? What is it telling the reader, me and you? Yeah, absolutely. Germany's going to benefit from the return of the SAR because with the SAR comes lots of heavy industry. You won't believe how many people wrote on your mock exam about pollution. Like, pollution is going to come into Germany because of this. Well, yes, to some degree, but they saw this and they saw this blowing over Germany and lots of people wrote about that. And that's not really what you want. So source A does support the return of the SAR to Germany. We know this because it shows. Describe what you see and then explain it using your own knowledge. Now, let's just have a quick look at what the mark scheme has suggested for this. So here's a level 2 answer. And it says, for example, the image shows an industrial area becoming part of Germany. This represents the industrial value of the SAR. The poster was published in the year of the plebiscite vote by the population to rejoin Germany. That's interesting because I didn't mention that a minute ago. You can talk about the provenance as well. You don't have to. It's not one of the questions that you have to talk about the provenance to get the top level, but this is definitely up for grabs. Okay, so if let's, for example, let's choose a different one and say that source A is critical of the Versailles Treaty. How do you know? Well, you can write about what the source is showing you, and maybe you might be able to comment on the provenance up at the top. You might not be able to, okay? It doesn't matter. If you look at the mark scheme, it says developed analysis of source based on content and or provenance. So it doesn't have to be both. So keep that in mind when you're answering it. And really, is this that much of a complex answer? I don't think it is. I think you could probably show way more knowledge explaining the source. So that's your first question. Source A is about something. How do you know? All the information is there. Pull it out and then use your own knowledge to explain it. So question number 2. This is where you're going to get 2 sources and it's going to ask you how useful they are to historians studying whatever it is, the League of Nations or the causes of the Second World War. So how useful are sources to a historian studying something? Are they always going to be useful? Yes, don't ever say no, okay? They're going to be useful to varying degrees, but they are always going to tell a historian something about either the League of Nations or the causes of a Second World War or the Treaty of Versailles or whatever it might be. So you're always going to say, yeah, absolutely, the sources are useful to some degree. And then this is the one where you need to evaluate the source's usefulness based on the content and the provenance. It's it's a 12-mark question, so roughly 6 marks on each sources. So one paragraph about source B and what it's telling a historian about the League or the causes of the Second World War, and then another paragraph about the usefulness of that source and what it's telling a historian about whatever the question's asking. So let's have a quick look at the sources. Once again, these are the ones that you did for your mock. So how useful is source B to a historian studying the League of Nations? Well, it is useful to a historian, isn't it? Because what's it showing about the League? Read the box. What's it telling you about the League in that box? Its successes, absolutely. It is useful to a historian because it's highlighting a number of the League's successes. For example, Sweden and Finland. It doesn't give you any more information than that, and you're expected to show an understanding from your own knowledge. But Sweden and Finland were arguing over the Åland Islands, well remembered, and the League of Nations hopped in there to stop a dispute, stop a potential war, and decided to give it to Finland, provided they didn't build military bases and forts. Absolutely. So again, this is useful to a historian because it's telling a historian some information about the League's successes. Another success, Upper Silesia. Germany was arguing with Poland. The plebiscite did not go Poland's way, so they called in the League of Nations. The League investigated and decided to give some of Upper Silesia to Germany and some to Poland. Neither side were happy, but it stopped a war. So this is useful to a historian, isn't it? It's telling a historian all about the League successes. Yeah, Poland got a good area, Germany got a rubbish area. Absolutely. So also, we're analysing the source's usefulness. So we're saying, look, it is useful because it tells us this. What are the limitations based on this bit up here? Yeah, and yes, and it's biased. And obviously you'd explain more of that in your exam, but it's also useful to a historian, or rather a historian would have to be careful in believing everything here, because like you said, there is some bias attached to it, because this information was published by the League of Nations. What was it published in? A recruitment pamphlet. So does that suggest that they're only going to, or they're going to focus more on the successes and their failures? Yes, absolutely. So this is useful to some degree. However, there are some limitations, and you can write about limitations. Don't make that the focus of your answer. If answer question is asking you how useful it is to a historian. But whilst you're talking about usefulness, if you're talking about limitations, you're coming to a judgment to how useful something is. If something has no limitations, then it's bloody really, really useful, isn't it? This, though, there are some limitations attached to it because it was produced by the League of Nations. It's a recruitment pamphlet, and that suggests to me that they're only going to focus on the positives because they're trying to recruit more countries to join. Yep, how useful is this to a historian studying the League of Nations? And you're going to say, absolutely, source B is useful to some degree because it highlights a number of the League's successes, and this would be helpful to a historian, and you explain those successes, and you can also talk about the limitations based on the provenance. Yeah, absolutely. If you're talking about that, it basically suggests that its failures are down to the lack of members, and that's why you should join, and that's why you should join, that's why everybody should join. It's almost guilt tripping countries into joining, isn't it? So go on. Absolutely. How many members were there of the League initially? 42. That's a hell of a lot. And now it's whining about not having enough members. So you could say, yeah, absolutely. Based on my own knowledge, I feel that they are just trying to justify their failures in a very simple way without actually recognizing their faults. So it is useful based on this, but there are some limitations attached to this. Show that detailed knowledge, just like we've just done then. Let's have a look at the next one. So how useful is this to a historian studying the League of Nations? Well, this is very useful to a historian because it shows one of the League's successes or failures. This is Japan, isn't it? It talks there, the figure holding the gun is Japan, who is on trial in front of the League of Nations in Geneva. Why is Japan on trial? Because they invaded Manchuria. So you talk about this, the usefulness of this. It is useful because it shows one of the major failures of the League of Nations, and you can talk about what it's showing there. You can talk about Japan thumbing his nose at the League. Why is Japan thumbing his nose? Yeah, because Japan, the League can't do anything. It's like, I don't care what you come up with. You can morally condemn me and we're just going to leave the League of Nations. You can impose economic sanctions, but their main trading partner is America, so it wouldn't work. So Japan is showing contempt for the judges. Whilst, what are they scrambling over here? Yeah, absolutely. They're trying to scramble through the Lytton report to try to pin something on Japan. What else is it useful based on the provenance? What is a provenance telling us? Yes. Yes. Absolutely. You're saying that Britain is one of the leading members of the League. So you would expect almost that many people in Britain support the League of Nations. Well, here is, okay, it's from a cartoon. It is a cartoon, but it definitely suggests that there are some people in Britain that do not respect or do not think much of the League of Nations because this source is critical, right? It is definitely criticizing the League, where this one is trying to big the League up, trying to remain positive. So yours is obviously not going to be on the League. I'm not going to tell you what yours is, okay, but it could be, it will be, sources B and C are useful to a historian studying something. Could be the causes of the Second World War. It could be the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, but they're always going to be useful to varying degrees. So make sure you are also thinking about limitations based on the source itself, what it's not showing you, or the provenance. Done. Well done. Right, let's look at the next one. The next one is, the account question. Okay, so you're going to write an account of how an event led on to a crisis. Okay, so the event could be anything. And you need to make sure that you are showing an understanding of that event and then not ignoring the next bit of the topic. So this one, it says the aims of a peacekeeper led to disagreements. So you're not just talking about the aims of Clemenceau or Woodrow Wilson or David Lloyd George. You are talking about that, but you're talking about how that led to disagreements. For example, Woodrow Wilson wanted self-determination. Who would have an issue with that? Britain, because Britain has a massive colony, empires, absolutely. So make sure you are not ignoring the next part of the question. Yours is write an account of how an event led to an international crisis. So make sure you are aware of events like the Rhineland, the Sudeten crisis, the Nazi-Soviet pact, events like that and how they led on to a crisis. Okay? Which means you need to make sure you are not just thinking about the event, but you're thinking long term. For example, the Sudeten crisis ultimately led on to the Nazi-Soviet pact. You could argue the Sudeten crisis led on to its own crisis because then Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, which basically caused the Second World War. You could argue that the Rhineland led on to more crises in the future because Hitler grew in confidence. It led on to the Rome-Berlin Axis signed between Hitler and Mussolini. It led on to Anschluss, which came next. So make sure you're aware not just of the events that we've studied, but how those events led on to problems in the future. Let's have a quick look at what they've written here. So this is a level 4 answer. So just one second, let's have a quick look at this. This is what you should be doing to get a top grade. So you present a coherent narrative / account, which is basically a story. You're writing an account of how the aims of the peacemakers led to disagreements, or you're writing an account of how the Sudeten crisis led on to problems, or you're writing an account of how the Rhineland led on to international crises. You're telling a detailed story. Try to do it in chronological order, so you're not mixing like your answer up. You're talking about one thing here and then you're talking about it later on near the end of your answer. Try to tell that story in a coherent way. So what are we looking for? Complex sequencing and reasoning supported by a range of accurate and detailed factual knowledge and understanding, which might be related to the how and the why tensions increased at different stages, or showing understanding about how much each part of a sequence increased tensions. So you're not writing it about tensions, but make sure you're analyzing. If you're doing something about like the causes of the war, make sure you're talking about the different stages. Is something a long way off the war? Is something much closer to the war, and as such would probably be more useful in understanding how or why something happened? Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. So what's it got? So right, peacemakers. For example, the opposing aims of the peacemakers led to disagreements because each leader had to pursue the best interests of their own country. France wanted this, whereas Britain wanted that. And that's like a level 4 answer. You could do that now. If I asked you about how because it's not even mentioning anything to do with yes, Woodrow Wilson, absolutely. Or even some of the disagreements which were had, like France wants this and Britain would hate that, or America wanted this and Britain would hate that. So you can get top level answers by showing a really detailed understanding of the event and what that then led on to. And then lastly, the last one, the big, well, it's 20 markers if we take SPAG into consideration. You're going to write an essay. And what you need to do is write about said factor. OK, so the policy of appeasement was the main cause of the Second World War. They want you to analyze that statement. They want you to write about how appeasement caused the Second World War. And then you can write about another factor. You say, however, there was also other reasons or other factors that led to the Second World War, such as, you say, a failure of the League of Nations, for example. And then you can write about that. Now, if you look at the mark scheme, it says complex explanation of stated factor and other factors. So technically, you only have to write about 2 factors and you can still get a top level on this. But you're going to have a bit longer in your exam, your mock exam, than you would have in a normal exam. So I would suggest that you are writing about 3. OK, whatever the question is asking you, you have to write about that factor that they give you, and then you write about 2 other ones. It asks you, how far do you agree with this statement? So you're going to get a statement and it's going to ask you how much you agree with it. And you can say, and if it was me, I would say, yes, I do agree with this. I agree with it to some degree. It is one of the main causes of the Second World War. And I'd write about it as a really important cause of the Second World War. Then I would say another really important cause of the Second World War was this. And a final main cause of the Second World War was something else. OK, I'm saying, look, they're all really important. But then in my conclusion, I go back to this statement and say, look, I agree with this partially, but I think the main cause of the Second World War was something else, if that is what you think. Ethan. Not in each paragraph, no, but in your conclusion, because in each paragraph, it becomes difficult because in this case, let's say you're writing about appeasement, just the failures of appeasement. And then you can just move on and write about something completely different that has no link, like the League of Nations or the failures of the League of Nations being a cause of the Second World War. So you don't have to link it in the actual paragraphs, but when you get to your conclusion and you're writing about what you think the main cause of the Second World War was, that's not your question. When you're writing about the main whatever, you're saying, I think this was the main one. And then a few sentences after that link other factors to show an understanding that other factors are also really important. So let's say yours is about The failures of a League of Nations, for example, and you're writing about the league failed for this reason, and then the league failed for another reason, and then the league failed for a third reason. And in your conclusion, you write about the main reason why you think the league failed, but also recognize that it is lots of factors all interlinking that brought the league to its knees. It wasn't just one factor by itself, although you think that's the main one. There were lots of other factors at work as well. And by linking those factors in your conclusion, you're showing a more complex understanding of the issues. You're not just saying that this is the main factor, this is the main factor, but there are lots of other things going on in the background as well. Ben. Yeah, well, you've got 2 hours in the room. So what we suggest is that you go in, you spend 15 minutes planning it. So before you go into the exam, I imagine you'd have some flashcards or something. You're doing last minute cramming. And then they say, right, bags down and everything, we're going to take you in. You sit down, they give you a paper and they say, right, now it's time to start. I reckon you should probably look through the questions and spend maybe 10 minutes just jotting down notes in the margin while everything is still fresh in your mind. And then go back, answer the questions for about an hour and a half, and then spend about 10 minutes checking your answers. And that will roughly be your... Yeah, it's an hour on that and an hour on the other one. So that's why I expect you to show a more complex understanding on this question rather than just writing about 2. I'd want you to try and write about 3. It doesn't mean that you can't get the top marks if you don't write about 3, but it just helps. So last thing, and I'm going to cut this off, the essay question, you're going to be writing about at least 2 factors, the factor they give you, and then at least 1 more using your own knowledge. Make sure you are focused on this question, okay? This statement here. Analyze the statement. Then you say that there are other causes of the war, there are other reasons why the league failed, and you write about those other reasons, showing your, and it says it here, your complex explanation, complex understanding, and then in your conclusion, you address this. Do you agree with the statement? You might agree with it. And you say, absolutely, I fully agree with it. I agree with it because of this. Blah, blah, blah. Explain yourself. Don't just write 1 or 2 sentences, detailed explanation in the conclusion, even if you feel like you're repeating yourself. If you think it's another factor, you say, yeah, look, that stated factor is important, but the main factor is this. You explain yourself and make sure you link things together. Ethan. Yeah, 100%. That's what I do. I agree with it to some degree. That's a horrible sentence. Yeah, I partially agree with his statement. It was one of the main causes of the Second World War. Explain it. Another main cause was this. Explain it. A third main cause was this. Explain it. And then in your conclusion, back to that question. Happy with that? It is straightforward, and I've got high hopes for all of you. Okay, I think you're going to do really, really well. So let me stop this. Stop recording.